On the 22nd of December, 2008, a well-known French investor called Thierry Magan de la Villehouchet entered his office on the 22nd floor of an office building in Manhattan, New York. He locked himself in his office, sat on his chair, put his leg on the desk, took sleeping pills, and left wrist. Thierry was 65 when he committed suicide, exactly 11 days after Bernard Madoff's arrest. The American fraudster investor who caused him a loss of up to $1.4 billion. Bernard used to collect money from people on the basis that he would invest it and give them profits. But in fact, he just takes the money and gives them a portion of it as profits, trying to instill greed in them and others. This man is probably the smartest fraudster in history. He managed to set up a fraud scheme that lasted for almost 40 years without being exposed. In 2008, when the truth was finally revealed, the investors who gave him money, including Thierry, lost more than $50 billion, which led to the suicide for investors, including Madoff's son. What did the man do to deserve the title of the smartest fraudster in history? How did he manage to trick the investors? How was his fraud exposed? And why his sons reported him? All the answers are in the upcoming minutes.
Bernie Madoff is breaking his silence. The con man behind the biggest Ponzi scheme in history decided to speak out from his prison.
Bernard Madoff, wearing handcuffs instead of cufflinks, arrived today at the place he will now call home. Madoff, who was sentenced to 150 years for running a giant Ponzi scheme, will serve his time at the...
In the late 1960s, an American businessman named Stanley Chase sold his share in a clothing manufacturing company owned by his family on the East Coast of the United States. After taking the money, he retired from the clothing industry and decided to look for someone who could invest his money. Chase had a friend who was knowledgeable about the stock market called Marty Gohl. They had been friends since their studies at Syracuse University. In 1970, Gohl introduced Chase to Bernard Lawrence Madoff, a brilliant young man who could manage his money and make him a significant profit. At the time, Bernard Madoff was 32 years old and owned a brokerage firm called Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities LLC, which had been founded in 1960. Chase was dazzled by the profits that Madoff returned to the investors who had entrusted him with their money. The question raised here is how Madoff managed to achieve such profits. This question has two answers. The first was Madoff's answer. He used to tell investors, like Chase, that he was using a guaranteed strategy in the stock market called arbitrage. Everyone believed in this answer for over 40 years. The true answer was revealed after his arrest. In fact, he was managing a famous fraud scheme called the Ponzi scheme. It was named after the man who invented and implemented it, Charles Ponzi. The scheme's concept was that the fraudster collect money from investors on the basis that he will invest it and give them returns profit. But in fact, Madoff used to attract investors by promising them extraordinarily high returns on their investments. However, when investors handed over the money, Madoff just deposited it into his personal bank account and paid returns to earlier investors using the money obtained from later investors. Chase was totally impressed and convinced by Madoff, so he decided to give him a portion of his money in order to invest. Madoff's profits were up to 14% annually, which prompted Chase to open accounts for his 3 sons, and over time, he opened more than 40 accounts with Madoff, but it was not enough for him. In the same year, 1970, Chase founded a company called Lambeth Company. The investors call it Feeder Fund. It was a fund that collected money from investors to invest in it. Actually, it fed another bigger investment fund, the Master Fund. When the Master Fund handed out the profits, the Feeder Fund took its share and handed out the profits to investors with a particular fee. Chase created the Feeder Fund to collect money from people and invest it with Madoff, taking a percentage from it. When he was sure that things were going well, due to the fact that Madoff had never lost before, he established a second feeder fund in 1973 called the Brighton Company, and 2 years later, in 1975, he established a third feeder fund called Popham Company. However, Chase was not the only source of money that entered Madoff's fund. In the late 1970s, an American businessman named Carl Shapiro was looking for a fund that carried out the arbitrage strategy. A man named Michael Lieberbaum recommended Madoff, and he assured him that the latter would be his best option. Shapiro's recognition gave Madoff a boost since he was a successful rich businessman in the clothing industry, so he was called the Cotton King. At first, Shapiro gave Madoff a small portion of his money as a trial, and then he gave him a larger portion. The two became friends, and their friendship lasted for almost 40 years until Madoff's arrest. Little by little, Madoff became known as the genius investment manager whom no one would lose, which got the attention of more people, including the American real estate man Norman F. Levy, who opened an account with Madoff in 1975 and kept it open until Levy's death in 2005. Madoff's relationship with this man in particular was the reason that the banking authorities in America trusted him, because they basically trusted Levy. For example, the senior officials of JP Morgan Bank in the late 70s, when they came to talk about Madoff, did not mention him by his name. They called him Levy's friend. The large and continuous profits that Madoff was distributing to investors, which were between 10% and 14% annually, were very suspicious. In the entire American market, there was no fund that generated such profits. People couldn't believe the suspicions. They claimed that the man invested Shapiro's and Madoff's money. They are very experienced men, and even if it was something suspicious, they would have exposed him immediately. Another major reason that helped Madoff gain investors' trust was that he had never hunted people to give him money. On the contrary, people were looking for him to invest their money, and most of them even insisted on him. Madoff continued to collect money from investors in the market until we entered the mid-80s. In this period, the computer greatly entered the investment industry. This gave banks and large companies a great ability to seize arbitrage opportunities in the market, and therefore Madoff was no longer able to trick people and tell them that the source of his profits is arbitrage operations. And here Madoff resorted to a new trick. In 1985, Madoff began telling investors that his fund would operate with a strategy called the split strike conversion strategy, which is a stock option trading strategy that involves the simultaneous purchase of long-term call options and short-term put options with the same strike price. Madoff kept working with this strategy until 2008. He was simply tricking people because he had never worked with this strategy before. It was just a facade and the source of profits for the investors that were happy with it was actually their money, which Madoff was moving between New York and London as camouflage, nothing more. The situation remained as it was until a very strange coincidence occurred in 1999. An associate at Rampart Asset Management named Frank Casey. He called a genius analyst that worked for him named Harry Markopoulos, and he told him that he met with the manager of Access International Advisors Fund, who is the French investor René Thierry-Magan de la Ville-Huchet, and he told Frank that he invests his money in a fund that makes 1% to 2% profit monthly. The fund is managed by Bernard Madoff. Frank asked Markopoulos to do his research and try to identify what strategy Madoff used to make such profits so that they could use it in the company. Markopoulos started working on the profit data of Madoff's fund that he got from Ville-Huchet's fund with the help of two other analysts working with him at the company. It took them months of work to come to the conclusion that Madoff had never worked with the strategy that he claimed he was using, and he was undoubtedly a fraudster since the data contains many loopholes. In June 2000, Markopoulos handed the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission, SEC, a file of 8 pages in which he gave them a well-detailed report about why he thought that Madoff's fund is a fund based on the Ponzi scheme and its data are illegal. For an unspecified reason, the SEC ignored Markopoulos' file and did not take it seriously. And then the events of September 2001 happened, and everyone was distracted. Madoff remained under radar without being exposed. But there is always an end to everything. In 2008, The global financial crisis was triggered. All the investors were in state of panic, especially when the Lehman Brothers Bank was declared bankrupt in 2008. So they went immediately to Madoff asking for a refund. Madoff had never minded refunding investors, since he used to take money from one investor to give it to another one. But this time things were a bit complicated. The refund requests were more than the money he had. By December 2008, investors had already taken $12 billion out of him. So he got broke, and there were many other investors asking him for a refund worth billions. Because of the crisis, Madoff could neither pay back the investors nor take credit from the bank. Madoff finally realized his downfall was close, so he decided to tell his two sons the truth that he had hidden for years. On the evening of December 14, Madoff took his sons Mark and Andrew to his apartment at East 64th Street in Manhattan and confessed while crying that he is a fraud. His investment empire was a Ponzi scheme, and the losses could be up to $50 billion. Mark and Andrew were mad at him. They immediately left the apartment and went to their lawyer. Then they reported the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan and the New York Securities and Exchange Commission. This was at night. The next day at 7:30 a.m., Madoff got arrested. 6 months later, he took a 150 years prison sentence. His eldest son, Mark, committed suicide in his Manhattan apartment after 6 months. In 2014, his young son, Andrew, died of cancer. On April 14, 2021, Bernard Madoff died at the Federal Medical Center in North Carolina of the Federal Prison Service after nearly 11 years in prison. And with that, goodbye till I return with more insightful criminal narratives. For more videos, subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon to never miss any updates.